There is a text that was buried in the Egyptian desert for nearly 1600 years. It was not lost by accident. It was not lost because time is indifferent and sand is patient. It was buried deliberately with intention by people who understood that if the words inside it were allowed to circulate freely, the entire architecture of institutional Christianity as they were constructing it would be unable to hold its own weight. The text is called the Gospel of Thomas. It was discovered in 1945 near the town of Nag Hammadi, along with 51 other documents sealed in a clay jar. And when scholars finally translated it, they found something that the earliest followers of Jesus apparently held as central to their practice, something so fundamentally different from what gets preached in churches today, that calling them the same religion requires either extraordinary intellectual gymnastics or a willingness to never look too carefully at either one. The Gospel of Thomas, saying 3, reads, and read this slowly because every phrase matters. If those who lead you say to you, "See, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, "It is in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. Read that again, slowly and with attention to what your own immediate reaction is, whether it is recognition, resistance, confusion, or something harder to name. Not the sky, not the sea, not some future judgment, not a place you go when you die if you believe the correct propositions. Inside of you and outside of you, right now, accessible right now. The entire spiritual project, according to this text, is self-knowledge, a specific, disciplined, transformative kind of self-knowledge that the Jesus of Thomas is relentlessly pushing his students toward. And the fact that most people who consider themselves Christian have never encountered this text, have never been told it existed, have never been given the tools to work with what it contains, that gap, that specific gap between what was practiced by the earliest communities around Jesus and what institutional Christianity became, is what this entire exploration is about. This is not a video about attacking Christianity. It is not a takedown piece. Some of the deepest, most rigorous spiritual practitioners in human history have worked within Christian institutional frameworks and produced genuinely transformative results. What this is, instead, is an honest examination of a distinction that the historical and textual evidence demands we take seriously. The distinction between the faith that Jesus himself apparently practiced and taught, and the faith that the church, in its various institutional expressions across 20 centuries, has organized itself around. These are not the same thing. They have different aims, different methods, different anthropologies, different understandings of what a human being is and what a human being can become. Understanding that difference is not a threat to genuine faith. It is, if anything, the beginning of it. In the years since the Nag Hammadi discovery was first published in widely accessible translations, the James Robinson edited complete collection appeared in English in 1977, a small but serious community of scholars, practitioners, and seekers has been working with what these texts contain. That community is larger now than it has ever been, partly because the internet has made the texts themselves and the scholarship around them accessible to people who would never have encountered them in a library or a university. And partly because the spiritual crisis of institutional religion has sent large numbers of serious people looking for exactly the kind of material these texts provide. You are, by the fact of being here and engaging with this material at this level of depth, part of that community. And what you do with this material, whether you work with it seriously and honestly over time, or whether you consume it and move on to the next interesting thing, will determine whether it actually changes anything for you. In the next 2 hours, you are going to encounter specific primary source documents, not vague references to ancient wisdom, but named texts with discoverable histories that you can go read yourself. You are going to understand why these texts were excluded from what became the official Bible, and what that exclusion cost in terms of practical spiritual technique. You are going to learn what modern neuroscience and cognitive psychology have begun to understand about the contemplative practices embedded in early Christian communities. You are going to get a concrete, step-by-step framework for working with these ideas in your own life. Not because someone told you to, but because the evidence across history, psychology, and lived practitioner experience makes the case that this material produces real, verifiable changes in how a person experiences reality. And you are going to encounter the honest limitations of this material. What we know, what we can reasonably infer, what remains genuinely uncertain, and what practitioners across different traditions have reported from their own experience. The distinction we are examining did not emerge gradually over centuries of slow drift. It was contested, argued over, politically fought about, and ultimately resolved, not by the evidence, but by power. Understanding how that resolution happened is essential to understanding what was lost and what remains recoverable. In roughly the first 2 centuries after the death of Jesus of Nazareth, there was not one Christianity. There were many Christianities. The scholar Elaine Pagels, whose work at Princeton over the past 5 decades represents some of the most careful historical scholarship in this field, documented in her 1979 book, The Gnostic Gospels, that early Christian communities held wildly divergent beliefs about who Jesus was, what his death meant, what happened after death, and most importantly for our purposes, what the goal of the spiritual life actually was. Some communities, drawing on what appeared to be very early traditions, understood the core project as inner transformation, a process of coming to know the divine reality that was already somehow present within human consciousness. Other communities, for reasons that were partly theological, partly political, and partly pragmatic, organized around a different set of emphases: institutional belonging, correct belief, ritual sacraments administered by ordained clergy, and a future reward for present obedience. By the time the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in 312 CE and began the process of making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, the question of which of these many Christianities would become the official. One had enormous political stakes: a religion organized around inner transformation and direct personal access to divine reality is very difficult to organize politically. A religion organized around institutional belonging, correct doctrine, and authorized clergy is exactly what an empire needs. The resolution of the theological debates of the 4th century, the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, the establishment of the official biblical canon, the systematic suppression of texts, and communities that did not conform to the emerging orthodoxy, was not purely a theological process, it was a political one. And the cost of that political resolution was the marginalization of a set of practices and understandings about human consciousness and divine reality that the evidence suggests were present in the earliest strata of the tradition. This is what makes the Nag Hammadi discovery so significant. When someone buried that jar of documents sometime in the late 4th century, probably a monk from the nearby Pachomian monastery at St. Pachomio's, hiding texts that the authorities had begun destroying, they were preserving something that official Christianity had decided was too dangerous or too inconvenient to keep. The 52 texts in that jar represent a window into the part of early Christianity that lost the political argument. And what those texts reveal, consistently and in detail, is a tradition primarily concerned not with correct belief, but with direct experiential knowledge. Gnosis, from the Greek word for knowledge, specifically the intimate first-person, transformative kind of knowledge that comes from actually encountering something rather than simply believing propositions about it. The Gospel of Thomas is the most studied of these texts, partly because its literary form, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, with almost no narrative framing, makes it easier to analyze for historical layers. Scholars like Stephen Davies of Misericordia University and Marvin Meyer of Chapman University have argued that portions of Thomas's sayings collection may predate the canonical Gospels, that some of the material in Thomas represents an earlier tradition possibly closer in time and geography to the historical Jesus than the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that made it into the official Bible. This is not a fringe position. It is debated among scholars, but the debate is a serious one between people who have spent their careers with this material. What makes this relevant to anything you actually care about is a specific question. If there were early Christian communities whose spiritual practice was organized around something meaningfully different from what institutional churches practice today, what exactly were they doing? What were the actual techniques? What was the specific understanding of human nature and divine reality that motivated those techniques? And does any of it actually work, not in a metaphorical or symbolic sense, but in the sense of producing real, measurable, verifiable changes in a person's experience and way of being? Those are the questions this entire exploration is built around, and we are going to take them seriously enough to actually go through the primary sources, the historical context, the psychological and neuroscientific research, and the practical implementation in enough detail that by the end of this you have something real to work with. Let us start with the theology, because without understanding what was actually being claimed, the techniques make no sense. The central claim of what scholars call the Gnostic or Thomasine tradition, the strand of early Christianity most clearly preserved in the Nag Hammadi texts, is that the divine reality is not primarily out there, external to the human person, requiring approach through an institution or a set of correct beliefs. The divine reality in this understanding is the deepest ground of what the human person actually is. Not metaphorically, not as an encouraging idea, but as an ontological claim about the nature of consciousness and being. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, puts it this way: those who say that the Lord first died and then rose again are wrong, for he first rose and then died. This is not a statement about the resurrection narrative. It's a statement about the logical order of spiritual transformation. First, you come alive to what you already are, then what was false in you can die. The sequence matters. And it is the opposite of what most institutional Christianity teaches, which is first you believe correctly about something that happened to someone else 2,000 years ago, and then eventually something happens to you. The Gospel of Truth, probably composed by Valentinus of Alexandria around 140 CE. Valentinus was briefly a serious candidate for Bishop of Rome before the more institutional faction won that particular internal election. It describes the human condition with a striking image. Humanity, it says, lives in a kind of fog or dream, not knowing its own nature, experiencing anxiety and fear as its baseline state, grasping after things that do not satisfy precisely because it does not recognize what it actually is. The solution for Valentinus is not primarily propositional. It is not being told the right things about Jesus and then believing them. It is something more like being woken up. The Greek word the Valentinian tradition uses is sometimes translated as awakening or recognition. Anagnosis in Greek, the moment of recognition in tragedy when the protagonist discovers the truth of his situation. The spiritual life in this tradition is a structured process of waking up to what is already true. This maps onto something that modern psychology and neuroscience have begun to document with some precision. The default mode network, identified in the late 1990s by researchers at Washington University, is the set of brain regions that becomes most active when we are not engaged in specific tasks, when we are daydreaming, ruminating, or engaged in what is sometimes called self-referential processing. This network is implicated in our sense of being a continuous, bounded self with a particular history and a particular set of concerns, and a consistent finding in contemplative neuroscience. The research emerging from labs like Richard Davidson's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Judson Brewer's at Brown University is that extensive contemplative practice significantly alters the activity patterns of the default mode network. It does not eliminate the self, but it changes the quality of the relationship to the self, from identification with the default mode's running commentary to something more like observing it. Practitioners across multiple traditions describe this shift in remarkably consistent terms. a reduction in baseline anxiety, an increased sense of what is sometimes called presence, an experience of the moment-to-moment quality of consciousness, as something inherently open and spacious rather than cramped and anxious. Now, is that what the early Thomasine Christians were doing? The honest answer is, we cannot be certain. They did not leave us laboratory protocols. But the convergence between what their texts describe and what modern contemplative neuroscience is documenting is striking enough to take seriously. And it is that convergence between the oldest strata of the tradition and the newest findings of the science that makes this material genuinely interesting, rather than simply historically curious. Here is something specific that you can do right now. Before we go any further, find a comfortable seated position. Spend 60 seconds simply noticing whatever is present in your awareness, not trying to change it, not evaluating it, just noticing. Thoughts, if there are thoughts. Sensations, if there are sensations. Sounds, the quality of the light, the feeling of the chair or the floor beneath you. And while you're doing that, try to notice not just the contents of experience, the thoughts and sounds and sensations, but the quality of awareness itself, the space in which those contents appear. What is that? What is that which is noticing? That is the question. That is the question at the center of the Thomasine tradition. When you come to know yourselves, not know about yourselves, know yourselves, the recursive turn of attention back onto itself. This is not a metaphor. This is a specific direction of investigation that these texts are pointing toward, and it is a direction that requires actual practice, not just intellectual agreement with a set of propositions. To understand why this practice matters and why it was so threatening to institutional Christianity, we need to understand the specific institutional architecture that was being built in the first 4 centuries of the Common Era, and why an emphasis on direct experiential knowledge was incompatible with it. The earliest Christian communities, the communities of Paul's letters written in the 50s CE, roughly 20 years after the death of Jesus, were small, economically marginal, geographically scattered, and institutionally minimal. Paul's letters reveal communities that had significant internal debates about authority, practice, and doctrine, but that were not yet organized around a hierarchy of ordained clergy with exclusive rights to perform sacraments. The authority structures in Paul's communities were charismatic rather than institutional. Authority derived from gifts of the Spirit, from recognized wisdom, from apostolic relationship to Jesus or his disciples, not from holding an institutional office. This is visible in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where he is clearly addressing a community that has multiple competing authority figures and no clear mechanism for resolving disputes between them. By the middle of the 2nd century, the situation was significantly different. The Bishop of Rome, Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE, was arguing strenuously for what he called apostolic succession, the claim that legitimate Christian authority derived from an unbroken chain of ordained office holders stretching back to the apostles, and specifically to Peter. Irenaeus' primary concern, as he explicitly states in his massive work against heresies, is the Gnostic communities that he describes as teaching that each person has direct access to divine knowledge without needing the mediation of the institutional church, its clergy, its sacraments, or its canon of approved texts. For Irenaeus, this was not just theologically wrong, it was socially and institutionally catastrophic. If everyone has their own direct line to God, there is no institution, there is no orthodoxy, there is no hierarchy with the authority to settle disputes, there is no church, at least not in the sense that Irenaeus needed there to be a church. What Irenaeus was trying to build, and he was trying to build it because he genuinely believed it was the only way Christianity would survive the hostile environment of the Roman Empire, was an institution capable of maintaining coherence and continuity across time and geography. That project required a fixed canon of scripture, an authorized interpretation of that canon, an ordination system that controlled who could teach and lead, and a clear boundary between orthodox and heretic. The Gnostic communities, with their proliferating texts, their emphasis on experiential knowledge that could not be externally validated, and their frequent indifference to institutional hierarchy were obstacles to every one of those requirements. The political resolution that followed, accelerated enormously by Constantine's conversion and the subsequent Christianization of the empire, resulted in the suppression of those communities and the burial or burning of their texts. The Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE, issued by Emperor Theodosius I, declared Nicene Christianity the only legal form of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Communities that did not conform were subject to legal penalties. This is not ecclesiastical history as a polite series of theological debates. This is a political process with real material consequences for real people. The monk or monks who buried the Nag Hammadi library were almost certainly responding to specific threats of exactly this kind. What was lost in that process, or rather what was buried, because it turns out you cannot permanently bury an idea if it is written down and sealed in a clay jar, was not just a set of heterodox theological propositions. What was lost was a set of practices, a specific technology of consciousness, a detailed understanding of what the human mind is capable of when it is trained in particular ways. And what the last 100 years of both archaeological discovery and neuropsychological research have begun to reveal is that those practices were describing something real. Let us get specific about what the practice actually was. This is the part that matters most for anyone who wants to take this material out of the realm of historical curiosity and into their actual life. The Thomasine tradition, as it emerges from the texts, centers on what we might call a practice of radical self-inquiry, not in the therapy culture sense of exploring your childhood and processing your emotions, but in the more radical sense of investigating the very nature of the self that would be doing that processing. What is this that calls itself I? Not as a philosophical puzzle to be solved intellectually, but as a direct investigation to be conducted in experience. The structure of this practice, as the texts describe it, has three distinct phases. The first is what the Gospel of Thomas calls seeking, an honest acknowledgement that you do not yet know what you are, that the version of yourself you have been operating as is not the final word, that there is something to find. This sounds simple, but is actually quite difficult, because the default orientation of human consciousness is to assume it already knows what it is. We have stories about ourselves, models of our own nature, habitual ways of interpreting our experience that we take for reality itself. The practice of seeking, in this context, means deliberately bracketing those stories, not permanently abandoning them, but temporarily setting them aside long enough to actually look. The second phase is what Thomas calls finding. And this is the moment the tradition describes with the most urgency and the most caution. The one who seeks will find. Saying 2 tells us, and when he finds he will be troubled. This is not a motivational poster. The trouble is specific. When you actually look at what is doing the looking, when you turn attention toward the quality of awareness itself rather than its contents, what you find is not what you expected. You do not find a solid, bounded, continuous entity called me. What you find is more like a field, a space, a quality of openness and presence that does not have the edges you assumed it had. This is disconcerting. The tradition is honest about this. It does not say, seek and you will find and it will be lovely. It says, you will be troubled, and then it says something interesting. Having been troubled, he will marvel. The trouble is not the destination, it is the gate. The third phase is reigning over all, a phrase that sounds grandiose and is often misread as suggesting some kind of special status. But in context, what the tradition means is something more specific. When the investigation into the nature of the self has been conducted thoroughly enough, when the marveling has settled into a stable recognition of what is actually present, the relationship to ordinary experience changes fundamentally. Not in the sense of transcending ordinary experience or escaping it, but in the sense of no longer being enslaved by it. The anxiety that operates as the baseline condition of unconscious human life. The anxiety that the gospel of truth describes as the fog in which we live begins to lose its grip. not because you have acquired a new belief, but because you have seen something directly. This is what distinguishes the Thomasine practice from what passes for spiritual development in most institutional religious contexts. Most institutional religion asks you to believe something, to hold a proposition as true, to maintain a relationship with a God understood as external to you, and to maintain that relationship through correct behavior and participation in institutional rituals. The Thomasine tradition is asking you to know something, specifically to investigate your own nature directly enough that the investigation produces a genuine experiential result, not just an intellectual understanding. Now, the honest scholarly admission here: we do not have a detailed manual for exactly how early Thomasine practitioners conducted this investigation. The texts we have are more like pointing fingers than instruction manuals. They say, look here, but they do not always specify exactly how. This is actually typical of contemplative traditions across cultures. The Zen koans are doing the same thing, as is the Vedantic inquiry associated with Ramana Maharshi in the 20th century, as is the practice of Rigpa recognition in Tibetan Buddhism. These are not traditions that hand you a step-by-step algorithm and tell you to execute it. They hand you a direction and challenge you to actually move in it. What we can do, drawing on the convergence of the textual tradition with both the broader history of contemplative practice and modern psychological research, is construct a serious working approach to this inquiry. And that is what the rest of this exploration is going to do. Before moving into the detailed practice framework, it is worth sitting with one more foundational text, one that makes the stakes of this distinction between church faith and Jesus faith as explicit as any text in the tradition. The Gospel of Mary, discovered in 1896 in a papyrus codex that predates the Nag Hammadi discovery by nearly half a century, presents a scene that is almost certainly historically constructed but theologically revealing. After the resurrection, according to this text, the male disciples are afraid and confused about what to do next. Mary Magdalene, presented here as having had the closest understanding of Jesus' teaching, shares what she received from him in private: a description of the soul's journey through various inner states, described in the language of ancient cosmology as a passage through a series of powers or psychological forces. Peter refuses to believe that Jesus would have shared teaching with a woman that he did not share with the male disciples. Levi rebukes Peter, saying, "Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. Now I see you contending against the woman like the adversaries. But if the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us." The obvious feminist reading of this text is available and legitimate. But there is a deeper point that is easy to miss. The argument between Peter and Levi is not just about gender, it is about the nature of spiritual authority. Peter represents the position that legitimate teaching must be channeled through an authorized institutional structure, and specifically through him, as the founder of the apostolic succession. Mary represents the position that legitimate teaching is grounded in direct, experiential insight. Levi's defense of Mary is ultimately an argument that direct knowing cannot be dismissed on the grounds of institutional authorization, and that institutional authorization cannot substitute for direct knowing. This argument between institutionally authorized doctrine and direct experiential knowledge is the argument that early Christianity lost when the institutional side won the political battles of the 3rd and 4th centuries. And the texts that were buried near Nag Hammadi are the record of the other side of that argument. What is at stake in that argument for a person living right now in the 21st century with access to all of these texts and also to 2,000 years of institutional Christian tradition? The answer depends on what you are actually looking for. If you want belonging, the genuine comfort of being part of a community, the structure of regular practice, the guidance of teachers who know the tradition, the connection across time to something larger than yourself, institutional Christianity can provide all of that. And it is not nothing. Those things matter. Belonging matters. Community matters. The ritual marking of life's important transitions matters. A person who is genuinely engaged with institutional Christianity and deriving real benefit from it is not doing something wrong. But if what you are looking for is the specific thing that the Thomasine tradition and the broader Gnostic strand of early Christianity is pointing toward, direct experiential knowledge of your own nature, a transformation of consciousness that changes the quality of your relationship to anxiety and suffering in the ordinary moments of life, then the institutional approach on its own is probably not going to get you there. Not because it is malicious, but because it was not designed for that purpose. It was designed for something else. And the technique for what you are actually looking for is different from the technique for institutional belonging. The technique begins with what the texts call single-eyedness. The Greek word in the canonical Gospels is translated in Matthew 6:22 as, "If your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light." The word is hapless, meaning simple, single, undivided. Most biblical commentators treat this as a moral metaphor. Be single-minded in your devotion. But in the context of the contemplative traditions, including the Thomasine tradition, this phrase is pointing at something more specific. The practice of undivided attention, not divided attention, which is the normal human mode, simultaneously planning, evaluating, remembering, hoping, fearing, but a quality of attention that is simply present to what is present, without division. This is much harder than it sounds. Human consciousness, left to its default mode, is almost never simply present. It is perpetually generating commentary, evaluation, comparison, anticipation. The default mode network is doing this continuously. The background noise of self-referential mental activity that William James called the stream of consciousness, and that Buddhist traditions often describe as the monkey mind, is the ordinary condition of human awareness. The practice of developing single-eyedness, undivided present attention, is a practice of learning to rest in what is actual rather than in the mental commentary on what is actual. The specific technique for beginning this practice, as reconstructed from the texts and the broader contemplative tradition, works like this. You sit comfortably with your spine reasonably upright, not rigid, but alert. You close your eyes. You bring your attention to the sensory experience of this moment, the feeling of breath moving through the body, the quality of sensation in the hands and feet, the temperature of the air, not thinking about these things, not generating sentences about them, simply registering them directly as sensation. When the mind generates a thought, and it will within seconds, because that is what minds do, you notice the thought as a thought. Without following it, without fighting it, without becoming interested in its content, you simply note thinking, and you return attention to direct sensory experience. This is not advanced practice. This is the entry point. And it is worth noting that it is functionally identical to practices found across multiple contemplative traditions. In Theravada Buddhist Vipassana, in Hesychast Christian practice, in Sufi Dhikr, in certain schools of Kabbalistic meditation, the convergence is not accidental. These traditions are, in their different cultural vocabularies, all pointing at the same fundamental capacity, the capacity to be aware of awareness itself rather than simply caught in the stream of mental content. The researchers at Richard Davidson's Laboratory for Effective Neuroscience have been studying this capacity for decades. What they have found consistently across multiple studies and multiple populations is that training in this kind of attention practice produces measurable changes in brain function, specifically in the circuits associated with emotional regulation, attentional stability, and the default mode network. The 2011 study by Sarah Lazar and colleagues at Harvard, demonstrating structural changes in the prefrontal cortex and insula in long-term meditators, was one of the first to suggest that these changes are not just functional, but anatomical. The brain, it turns out, is not a fixed piece of hardware. It responds to training. The contemplative traditions have always known this. Neuroscience has been catching up, but here is where this becomes specifically relevant to the distinction between church faith and Jesus faith. The institutional church, across its many denominations and traditions, has historically not taught this kind of practice. There are exceptions: the Hesychast tradition within Eastern Orthodoxy, the centering prayer movement in Roman Catholicism, certain strands of Quaker practice, some expressions of Methodist and Anglican mysticism. These are real and valuable, but they are marginal to the institutional mainstream, and they are often treated with suspicion within institutional context precisely because they tend to produce practitioners who report that they do not need the institution's mediation to access divine reality. The direct encounter, when it actually happens, has a destabilizing effect on institutional authority. This is exactly what Irenaeus was worried about in the 2nd century. He was not wrong about the institutional implications, he was wrong on the evidence about whether the practice itself was valid. Let us be concrete about the practice structure, because vague spirituality is not useful to anyone. If you are starting from nothing, no background in contemplative practice, no prior experience with attention training of any kind, the first month of this practice should look like this: 20 minutes per day, in a consistent location and at a consistent time. Morning is usually best, before the day's demands have fully colonized your attention. Sit comfortably. Set a timer. Spend the first 3 minutes simply noticing the transition from activity to stillness, letting the mental activity of the morning gradually settle. Do not try to force stillness. You cannot force stillness any more than you can force a river to stop flowing. You can, however, stop adding turbulence. So for those first 3 minutes, you are simply stopping the addition of turbulence. From minute 3 to minute 15, your practice is what the tradition calls bare attention, a phrase used by the scholar Bhikkhu Bodhi in his translation of Theravada texts, and applicable here. You rest your attention lightly on the sensation of breathing, the physical sensation of air moving in and through and out of the body, the rise and fall of the chest or belly. When the mind generates a thought, you notice the thought, label it gently as thinking, and return to the breath. Not with force, not with frustration, simply returning. Each return is the practice. There is no failure here. The moment of noticing that the mind has wandered, that moment of noticing is already the practice. You cannot notice that you have been lost in thought without already having recovered the quality of awareness that is the goal. From minute 15 to minute 20, you expand attention from the specific anchor of the breath to the full field of present experience. Everything that is arising, sounds, sensations, thoughts passing through awareness, the quality of the space in which all of this is occurring, not analyzing any of it, not identifying with it, just noticing. And at the end, before you move, spend 30 seconds asking the Thomasine question: what is this that is noticing? Not as an intellectual puzzle, as a genuine question directed at direct experience. The Thomas texts use the phrase, the living one, for something that is at once the deepest nature of Jesus and the deepest nature of the human person. Saying 37 gives an instruction about how to find the living one that is startling in its concreteness. When you undress without being ashamed, and take your clothes and put them under your feet like little children and trample on them, then you will see the Son of the Living One and you will not be afraid. This is allegorical, but it is a specific allegory. The clothes are the identity constructs, the stories, the self-images, the roles we wear. Undressing without shame and trampling on them is the practice of setting those constructs aside, without the self-rejection that often accompanies any challenge to self-image. You are not your self-image. You can examine your self-image without needing to defend it, and when you can do that, something else becomes visible, something the text calls the Son of the Living One, which in context means the deepest nature of consciousness itself. None of this requires leaving a church. None of this requires abandoning the framework of Christian practice if you find genuine value there. What it requires is adding something that institutional Christianity largely dropped: the direct investigation of your own consciousness, conducted with the rigor and honesty and patience that any serious investigation requires. The practitioner experiences across history that most clearly illuminate what is possible here come from a surprising diversity of sources. The 14th century German Dominican mystic Meister Eckhart, who operated within the institutional church and was eventually brought up on heresy charges, 14 of his propositions were condemned by Pope John XXII in 1329, though Eckhart died before the condemnation was issued. wrote extensively about what he called the Abgeschiedenheit, the detachment that is the ground of all genuine spiritual life. For Eckhart, the fundamental error of most religious practice was the assumption that you need to find God somewhere, in church, in scripture, in correct practice. God is closer to me than I am to myself, he wrote. My being depends on God's intimate presence. The practice for Eckhart was not acquiring something new, but clearing away what obscured recognition of what was already present. Eckhart's contemporary Julian of Norwich, an English anchorite who received a series of visions during a serious illness in 1373 and spent the next 20 years reflecting on their meaning, came to a remarkably similar conclusion from within conventional Catholic practice. Her Revelations of Divine Love, the first book in the English language known to have been written by a woman, articulates a theology of divine love that is radically non-transactional. For Julian, God is not a being who needs to be appeased or bargained with. God is what she calls the ground of our beseeching. The very basis of the desire for God that motivates prayer is itself divine. The seeking and the sought are, at bottom, the same. Julian arrived at this not through heterodox texts, but through sustained contemplative practice conducted within an orthodox institutional framework, which suggests that the practice itself, when conducted seriously enough, tends to arrive at the same place regardless of the institutional container. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk and social critic whose death in Bangkok in 1968 remains a subject of controversy, spent the last years of his life in a remarkable dialogue with Asian contemplative traditions, specifically with the Tibetan Buddhist teacher Chatrul Rinpoche and with the Zen master D.T. Suzuki. What Merton found, repeatedly and with a kind of astonished delight, was that the deepest insights of the Christian contemplative tradition and the deepest insights of the Buddhist and Taoist traditions were pointing at the same thing. Not the same theology. The theologies are very different, but the same experiential territory. Merton's notes from his Asian journey, published posthumously as the Asian Journal, document his growing conviction that the divisions between traditions mattered far less than the divisions between serious contemplative practice and the absence of it. A sincere Christian with a genuine practice and a sincere Buddhist with a genuine practice have more in common with each other than either has with a nominal member of their own tradition going through institutional motions without any actual inner work. This is not an argument for spiritual eclecticism or for the kind of cafeteria spirituality that picks items from multiple traditions without the discipline to go deep into any of them. Depth requires commitment, but depth in any tradition that takes genuine inner transformation seriously, tends to produce recognizable results, and those results converge with what the Thomasine texts are describing. Let us get specific about what those results actually look like in practice, because this is the part that separates serious contemplative literature from inspirational content. The first and most commonly reported result of consistent practice, consistent meaning months to years, not days or weeks, is what practitioners across traditions describe as a change in the quality of background experience. Not a change in circumstances, not a change in beliefs, a change in the felt quality of simply being alive. The baseline condition of anxious self-monitoring that characterizes ordinary human consciousness begins to loosen. This does not mean the absence of difficulty or of pain or of fear when fear is appropriate. It means that the layer of chronic, low-grade background anxiety, the anxiety of not knowing whether you are okay, whether you are enough, whether the ground beneath you is solid, begins to thin. Practitioners report this not as a dramatic transformation, but as a gradual, sometimes barely noticeable shift that only becomes apparent in retrospect. I realized at some point that I was not worried about things I used to be worried about all the time is a common way of expressing it. The second result, closely related to the first, is an increased capacity for what the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi called flow, the state of full engagement with present activity in which the self-monitoring that normally accompanies action falls away. Athletes call it being in the zone. Artists describe it as the work making itself. Contemplative practitioners describe it as simply presence. The neuroscientific research on flow states, much of it emerging from the work of Arne Dietrich at the American University of Beirut, who coined the term transient hypofrontality to describe the neural signature of flow, suggests that what happens neurologically in these states is a temporary reduction in activity in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with self-monitoring and metacognitive evaluation. The same reduction that is associated with long-term contemplative practice appears to underlie the flow states that people experience in all kinds of engaged activities. The contemplative practice, in this understanding, is training the brain to access a version of this state more consistently and with more stability. The third result, which takes longer to emerge and is harder to articulate, is what the Thomasine texts call reigning over all, and what Julian of Norwich calls all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. This is not optimism. It is not positive thinking. It is a quality of relationship to the totality of experience, including difficulty, including loss, including the ordinary painful facts of human life, that comes from actually having investigated what experience actually is. When you have looked carefully enough at the nature of awareness itself, when you have verified in direct experience that awareness is not a thing that can be damaged or destroyed in the way that its contents can be damaged or destroyed, there is a quality of groundedness that becomes available that is different in kind from the groundedness that comes from having good circumstances or correct beliefs. Julian wrote her revelations in the aftermath of an almost fatal illness, during a period of enormous social upheaval. The Black Death had killed perhaps half of England's population in her lifetime. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was in living memory, and her famous phrase, "all shall be well," was written in full awareness of the suffering she was surrounded by. It is not denial, it is a report from a specific depth of practice. The fourth result, which is perhaps the most practically relevant for contemporary life, is what the Buddhist tradition calls equanimity, the capacity to be fully present to experience, including intense experience without being destabilized by it. Not detachment in the sense of not caring, equanimity in the sense of caring without losing your footing, the capacity to be in the middle of something difficult without the difficulty taking over and running the show. Practitioners often describe this as the most valuable practical outcome of contemplative practice, more valuable than the metaphysical insights, more valuable than the moments of transcendent experience, because it changes the actual quality of everyday life and especially the quality of relationships. All of these results require one thing: consistent practice over time, not spectacular practice, not crisis practice, the kind of intense engagement with spiritual material that happens when life falls apart and then fades when things stabilize. Consistent, ordinary, undramatic daily practice, 20 minutes in the morning, attention to what is present, return when lost, repeat. This is not coincidentally exactly what the most effective psychotherapeutic interventions for anxiety and depression have converged on. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, developed by John Teasdale, Mark Williams, and Zindel Siegel in the 1990s, based on the work of John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction program developed at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in the 1970s, has been demonstrated in multiple randomized controlled trials to reduce the risk of recurrence in major depression as effectively as antidepressant medication for patients with 3 or more previous episodes. The mechanism, as the researchers describe it, is learning to observe the relationship between thoughts and emotions rather than being automatically controlled by it, which is in the vocabulary of the Thomasine tradition, learning to know yourself rather than being enslaved by the parts of yourself you have not examined. This convergence between the oldest surviving strata of the Christian contemplative tradition and the most evidence-based current psychological interventions is not an accident. And it is not a coincidence. It is a validation, not a scientific proof of theological claims, but a practical validation of the underlying observation that motivated the tradition in the first place. The observation that the quality of human experience is not fixed, that it can be trained, that training it has specific and recognizable effects, that the most fundamental dimension of the training involves learning to be present to what is present, rather than consumed by the mental commentary on what is present. Now, let us be honest about what this does not do, because intellectual integrity requires acknowledging the limits. Contemplative practice does not eliminate suffering. Julian of Norwich, Meister Eckhart, Thomas Merton, none of them lived charmed lives free of pain. Merton was in genuine existential turmoil for much of his later life. Eckhart died under a cloud of ecclesiastical condemnation. Julian wrote from within an experience of physical near-death in the context of a society racked by plague and upheaval. The tradition does not promise that practice will make your circumstances better. It promises something more modest and more radical, that your relationship to your circumstances can change in a way that changes the quality of your experience of them. That is different from the prosperity gospel that infects much of contemporary institutional Christianity. It is also different from the implicit promise of secular therapy, that if you understand your history well enough, you will be freed from its effects. The contemplative claim is that understanding, however deep, is not the same as the direct recognition that the tradition points toward. You can understand everything about your anxiety without being freed from it. You can know the whole story of why you are the way you are without the knowing making any difference to how you are moment to moment. The practice is not about understanding. It is about a different quality of attention. The second limitation that requires honest acknowledgement is that these practices, like all powerful tools, can be misused. There is a long history of contemplative practice being appropriated by narcissistic individuals to provide a spiritual framework for ordinary self-centeredness, the phenomenon that the psychologist John Welwood, who coined the term, called spiritual bypassing, using spiritual ideas and practices to avoid dealing with psychological material that needs genuine, often difficult engagement. A person who uses contemplative practice to avoid feeling grief or to rationalize abusive behavior as detachment or to maintain grandiose self-images under the cover of spiritual advancement is not doing what the tradition intends. The Nag Hammadi texts themselves are aware of this risk. The Gospel of Philip, saying 77, notes, "He who has knowledge of the truth is a free man, but the free man does not sin. For he who sins is the slave of sin." The freedom that genuine practice produces is a freedom that manifests in increased ethical sensitivity and care for others, not in decreased accountability. If a spiritual practice is making you less accountable to others, you are probably doing something wrong. The third limitation, and this is the one that institutional Christianity gets right more often than the contemplative traditions acknowledge, is that human beings need community. The individual sitting alone in a room doing 20 minutes of attention practice is doing something real and valuable, but they are doing it in a context of isolation that is historically anomalous and practically difficult. Every contemplative tradition that has produced deep and stable practitioners has done so within communities, sanghas, monasteries, convents, hermit communities, organized around shared practice, teacher-student relationships. The Thomasine communities almost certainly had social structures of some kind. We do not know the details, but the fact that the texts were copied and transmitted and ultimately buried together rather than scattered suggests that there were communities organized around their use. The contemporary spiritual seeker who has left institutional religion because of legitimate grievances against its institutional failures but has not found a community of practice is in a genuinely difficult position. You cannot fully substitute a YouTube video or a podcast or even the best books for the kind of relationship that develops between practitioners who are working with the same material over time, who can reflect each other's experience honestly, who can provide the kind of challenge that genuine community provides. And that isolation cannot. This is not an advertisement for any particular organization or teacher. It is an honest acknowledgement of a real limitation of the individual practice approach. Before going into the detailed practice structure, it is worth pausing to address the most common objection that people raise at this point, because it is a legitimate one and deserves an honest response. The objection is, isn't all of this just Buddhism repackaged in Christian vocabulary? Or isn't this just mindfulness, which has already been completely absorbed by the wellness industry and stripped of anything genuinely transformative? These are fair questions. To the first, the similarities between the Thomasine tradition and Buddhist contemplative practice are real and documented, and they have given rise to a serious scholarly literature, the work of Gregory Riley at Claremont, the work of Raymond Panikkar on the relationship between Christian and Hindu mysticism, the work of Thomas Merton himself, who spent years thinking carefully about exactly this question. The honest answer is that either both traditions are pointing at the same thing independently, which would be remarkable but not impossible, or there was some degree of cross-pollination in the ancient world between the Indian contemplative traditions and the communities in the Eastern Mediterranean that produced early Christianity, which recent historical scholarship on the Silk Road trade routes makes more plausible than it once seemed. Either way, the convergence is evidence that the territory is real, not that both traditions are confusing themselves in the same way. Two maps that agree about the location of a mountain are more reliable than one map alone, even if the maps were drawn in different styles. To the second objection, isn't this just mindfulness? The honest answer is both yes and no. The attentional component of what we have been describing overlaps with what is currently marketed as mindfulness. But the full scope of what the Thomasine tradition is pointing toward goes considerably beyond stress reduction or attentional training. The inquiry into the nature of awareness itself, the question, what is aware right now, is not a standard feature of clinical mindfulness interventions, and for good reason. The clinical context has different goals than the contemplative context. The clinical goal is symptom reduction and improved functioning. The contemplative goal is what the tradition calls gnosis, a direct, transformative recognition of the nature of consciousness that changes not just how you function, but what you understand yourself to be. These are related, but not identical. The mindfulness research validates one dimension of the practice. The broader contemplative tradition is claiming something more, and making that something more available requires working with the material at a deeper level than an 8-week MBSR course is designed to provide. The approach that makes most sense for someone beginning this work from scratch, drawing on both the textual tradition and the practical wisdom of contemporary practitioners, looks something like this. In the first week, the practice is simply establishing the habit. 20 minutes, same time, same place. The content of those 20 minutes matters less than the fact of doing them. Use the breath as the anchor. Notice when you have wandered. Return. That is the whole practice for the first week. Do not try to evaluate whether you're doing it correctly. There is no correct, except returning when you notice you have wandered. In the second week, begin working with a specific Thomas, saying as a contemplative object. Not analyzing it, not reading commentary about it, sitting with it and letting it work on you. A good starting point is saying two, which we have already examined. Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will reign over all. Read it once, slowly, then sit. And in the sitting, ask, what does it mean to genuinely seek? Not to have found, to be seeking right now. What does that actually feel like? In the third week, introduce the inquiry into the nature of awareness itself. After the initial settling period of your sitting, ask, what is aware right now? Not as a philosophical question, as a question directed at direct experience. What is the quality of this that is noticing? The mind will immediately try to answer the question with a thought, awareness is X, consciousness is Y. Notice that tendency and gently set it aside. The question is not asking for a thought, it is asking you to look at what is prior to thought. In the fourth week, begin extending the practice into ordinary life. Not sitting more, but bringing the quality of attention you are training in sitting into everyday activity. Washing dishes with full attention to the sensation of hot water and the movement of hands. Walking with attention to the kinesthetic sense of the body moving through space. Conversation with attention not just to the content of what is being said, but to the quality of your own listening. These are not mystical exercises. They are training the capacity for present moment awareness in the context in which most of life actually occurs. There is something worth noting about the relationship between this practice and ordinary Christian prayer, because many people who come to this material have a background in conventional religious practice and feel uncertain about whether what they have been doing has value. The short answer is yes, absolutely. The long answer is more nuanced, conventional Christian prayer. Petitionary prayer, liturgical prayer, the recitation of the offices, the practice of lectio divina. These are not obstacles to the kind of inquiry we have been describing. They can be, and historically have been for many practitioners, foundations for it. The difference is one of direction. Most conventional prayer is directed outward and forward, toward a God conceived as external, asking for something, expressing thanks for something, receiving the words of Scripture as information about a divine reality outside oneself. The Thomasine inquiry adds a turn that most conventional prayer does not include, a turn of attention back toward the source of the attention itself. You can pray in the conventional sense and then in the silence after ask, what is the quality of this that is praying? Where does the prayer come from? What is the awareness within which the prayer arises? These are not blasphemous questions. They are the questions that every serious mystic in the Christian tradition has eventually arrived at. The hesychast tradition of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which preserves the most direct institutional transmission of this kind of practice, within Christianity provides a useful model, the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, is, in the hesychast teaching, not primarily a petition. It is a practice of attention training. The practitioner repeats the prayer, synchronizing it with the breath, gradually interiorizing it from verbal repetition to mental repetition to what the tradition calls the prayer of the heart, a condition in which the prayer becomes continuous in awareness like a background tone, and the practitioner rests in what Gregory Palamas in the 14th century called the uncreated light. The uncreated light in Palamite theology is not a metaphor, it is a direct experiential reality that long-term practitioners of the hesychast method report with remarkable consistency. Whether that reality is what Palamas' theology says it is, the actual uncreated energies of God, is a theological question we cannot resolve empirically. But that something is being reported, and that it is reported consistently by practitioners who have worked seriously with this method, is beyond reasonable doubt. The second month builds on this foundation with increased attention to what the tradition calls the powers or psychological forces that resist this kind of practice. Every serious contemplative tradition has a detailed map of these obstacles. In Evagrius Ponticus's 4th century Christian monastic tradition, they are the 8 logismoi, the 8 thoughts or passions that interrupt genuine practice. In Buddhist psychology, they are the 5 hindrances. In the Valentinian tradition, they appear as the archons, cosmic forces that maintain the fog in which unconscious human life is spent. The specific vocabulary is less important than the underlying observation, which is consistent across traditions. The movement toward genuine self-knowledge is resisted by forces within the psyche that have an investment in the maintenance of the current arrangement. The most common of these in contemporary life is what the tradition calls variously distraction, acedia, the monastic term for the kind of listless avoidance that looks like spiritual dryness but is actually resistance to practice, and simply boredom. The capacity to sit with boredom without immediately reaching for stimulation is one of the core competencies that contemplative practice develops. Because boredom is very often the surface texture of exactly the resistance that the practice is trying to get underneath. When the mind says, "This is boring, nothing is happening, I'm not progressing," that is the moment to stay and to notice what is underneath the boredom. There is almost always something there, not something dramatic, something real. The second major obstacle is what Evergreas called vainglory and what the psychological literature calls performance orientation. The tendency to turn the practice itself into an object of self-evaluation, to assess whether you are doing it correctly, making progress, becoming more spiritual, comparing favorably to other practitioners. This is, in the Thomasine vocabulary, the clothes that the practice is supposed to help you take off. If you are using the practice to build a better self-image, you are wearing the clothes more tightly than before. The instruction is to notice this tendency when it arises. And it will arise, because it is very deeply embedded in human psychology. And to set it aside with the same gentle return that you apply to any other thought in practice. The third obstacle, which becomes relevant somewhat later in the practice trajectory and is worth naming even at the beginning, is what the tradition calls the fear of the open. This is the experience that the Gospel of Thomas names as troubled. The disconcerting recognition when attention actually turns toward awareness itself. That what is found there is not what was expected, not a solid, bounded, manageable me with clear edges and known properties, but something more like a field, a space, an openness that does not have the reassuring definiteness of the object self we normally operate as. This is not pathological. It is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that the practice is working. But it can feel very uncomfortable, and many practitioners bail out at exactly this point, returning to the comfort of mental activity and institutional belonging, because the open is unfamiliar and uncomfortable. The instruction for working with this, consistent across traditions, is simple. Stay. Not in the sense of forcing yourself through something terrible, but in the sense of allowing yourself to remain with what is present without immediately resolving the tension by going somewhere else. The trouble that Thomas describes is not permanent, it is a gate. On the other side of it is what the tradition calls marveling, a quality of astonished recognition that is in every account of it across every tradition, described as profoundly positive. There is something worth naming specifically about the relationship between this practice and grief. Because grief is one of the most universal human experiences, and because the way contemplative practice interacts with it is often misunderstood, the Thomasine tradition does not promise the elimination of grief. Julian of Norwich, in the midst of describing the highest reaches of contemplative insight, also wrote some of the most unsparing descriptions of anguish in the English language. The practice does not remove the human from the human. What it changes is the relationship to grief, the quality of presence within which grief is held. A person who has developed real contemplative depth does not grieve less than others. They grieve, in some ways, more fully, more directly, without the layers of avoidance and self-protection that ordinarily mute the full impact of loss. But the grief does not destabilize them in the same way, because the ground within which the grief arises is experienced as more stable than the grief itself. This is not stoicism. It is not detachment. It is something more like the capacity to be with what is, without needing it to be otherwise, without the grief being compounded by the additional layer of suffering that comes from resisting what is already present. Rainer Maria Rilke, writing from within a tradition that was neither conventionally religious nor conventionally secular, described this quality in his Letters to a Young Poet with a precision that is worth quoting in its essence. The task is to live the questions, not to try to find the answers. He was writing about artistic practice, but he was describing something that applies equally to contemplative practice. The questions, what am I? What is aware? What is the nature of this? Are not problems to be solved and set aside. They are orientations to be inhabited. The living of the question, sustained over time, is itself the practice. By the end of the first year of consistent practice, 20 minutes per day, maintained through the ordinary impediments of daily life, Most practitioners report a shift that they find difficult to describe to people who have not done similar work. It is not a dramatic shift. It is more like the difference between looking at a landscape through a window and actually being outdoors in it. The same landscape, but a different quality of contact with it. The mental film of commentary and evaluation is still there. It does not go away in a year or in 10 years, but it has become recognizably what it is. Commentary, not reality itself. And that recognition, simple as it sounds, is what the Gospel of Thomas is describing when it speaks of knowing yourself. It is worth noting here something about the relationship between this practice and the Orthodox Christian framework. The Christian doctrine of the Trinity, the understanding of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, can be read through the lens of the contemplative tradition as a map of exactly this territory. The Father, in this reading, is not a personal God in the anthropomorphic sense, but the ground of being itself, what Paul Tillich called the ground of all being, what Eckhart called the Godhead as distinct from God. The Son is the dynamic expression of that ground, the logos, the principle of form and recognition by which being knows itself, and the Holy Spirit is the active, immanent presence of that ground in moment-to-moment experience, what Julian calls the ground of our beseeching. Read this way, the Trinity is not a three-headed deity that requires intellectual acceptance as a condition of belonging to the correct institution. It is a phenomenological map of the structure of consciousness as it recognizes itself. The Father is the openness of awareness itself. The Son is the recognition that arises within that openness. The Spirit is the living quality of that recognition in the here and now. This is a speculative reading, and the institutional tradition has never endorsed it as official doctrine, but it is consistent with the most profound Christian mystical writers, Eckhart, John of the Cross, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, Gregory of Nyssa, and it suggests that even within the Orthodox framework, there is more room for the kind of practice we have been describing than institutional Christianity's mainstream presentation usually acknowledges. The question of what happens with sustained practice over years and decades is one of the most interesting and least documented areas of this territory. The institutional tradition has monasteries and convents where practitioners have been doing this work for 20, 30, 40 years, and the reports from those environments are informative even when filtered through conventional theological language. The phenomenon that contemplatives across traditions describe after many years of serious practice, sometimes called stable non-dual awareness or abiding presence, or in the Christian language, union, is a state in which the shift in the quality of awareness that earlier practice produces episodically becomes more or less continuous. Not a constant state of ecstasy, not a state incompatible with ordinary life. A quality of presence that is present consistently in the background of all experience, like a clear sky that may have clouds in it, but whose fundamental nature as sky is not occluded by the clouds. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which has the most detailed and technically precise literature on this long-term trajectory, describes a distinction between recognition, Rigpa, and stable recognition, Rigpa-sao, that is relevant here. Recognition is the initial experience of what is sometimes called the nature of mind, the open, luminous, aware quality that is the ground of all experience. Stable recognition is the development of that recognition into a consistent orientation that is no longer disturbed by ordinary mental activity. The distance between those two is measured in years of practice, not days or weeks, and the reports from those who have traveled that distance, whether in Tibetan Buddhist or Christian or Sufi or Vedantic contexts, are remarkably consistent. Ordinary life becomes more rather than less vivid. The capacity for relationship deepens. The concern for the well-being of others increases rather than decreases. The preoccupation with one's own spiritual status gradually dissolves. That last point is worth emphasizing because it runs counter to the common assumption about what advanced spiritual practice looks like. The most reliable indicator of genuine depth, according to virtually every serious contemplative tradition, is not special experiences or capacities or the ability to talk persuasively about spiritual matters. It is ordinariness. The Zen tradition has an image for this. The 10 ox herding pictures, The series of drawings that map the stages of the contemplative journey, the final image, after the progressive deepening of practice and the experiences and insights that accompany it, shows an ordinary person going to market. Not glowing, not levitating, just ordinary, present, going to market. This is, in the end, what the Thomasine Jesus is pointing toward. Not a special status, not membership in the correct institution, not possession of correct beliefs, simply knowing what you are. Actually knowing it, not as a concept, but as a living recognition that pervades ordinary experience. The kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. Everywhere you look, if you are actually looking. Right now, the question of measuring progress in contemplative practice is one that the tradition handles carefully and that modern practitioners often handle carelessly. The careful handling the tradition recommends involves not treating special experiences as the primary metric. Peak experiences, moments of profound calm, episodes of unusual clarity, the occasional experience of what practitioners describe as the open, are real and meaningful, but they are not reliable indicators of practice depth, and treating them as such leads to a kind of spiritual trophy hunting that actively interferes with genuine development. The more reliable metrics are behavioral and relational. How do you behave under stress? What is the quality of your attention in ordinary conversations? How quickly do you recover from disturbance? Do people who know you well notice anything different about you over time? These are not glamorous questions, but they are the questions that actually track what the practice is doing. The 30-day practice roadmap, assembled from the textual tradition and the experience of contemporary practitioners, works roughly as follows. Days 1 through 7 are establishment. The same structure every day, building the habit before working on the content. Days 8 through 14 introduce the Thomas sayings as contemplative objects. Not all 114, but perhaps a handful, sat with one at a time. Days 15 through 21 introduce the explicit awareness inquiry. Days 22 through 30 integrate the practice into ordinary daily life, adding the micro-practices described earlier, and paying particular attention to what arises in conversations and relationships. At the end of 30 days, the only evaluation question worth asking is, did I do it? Not did something dramatic happen? Not am I more spiritual than before? Did I show up every day and do the simple thing? Because the simple thing, done every day for 30 days, is worth a great deal more than intense spiritual experiences that leave no trace in ordinary behavior. The reason for the very precise language we are using here, every day, 20 minutes, the same structure, is that the research on habit formation is unambiguous on this point. James Clear's synthesis of the behavioral research in Atomic Habits, drawing on the original work of habit researchers like Charles Duhigg and Wendy Wood, documents that behavioral change requires repetition in consistent contexts to the point where the behavior becomes automatic rather than effortful. The first 3 weeks of any new practice are the hardest because the cue routine reward neural circuit that underlies automatic behavior has not yet been established. After roughly 3 weeks of daily practice, the friction decreases noticeably. After 3 months, the practice begins to miss you when you skip it. You notice its absence rather than its presence. This is not a spiritual insight, this is behavioral neuroscience, but it applies to contemplative practice exactly as it applies to any other form of behavioral training. The reason the distinction between church faith and Jesus faith matters so urgently in the current moment is that institutional religion is in crisis in the Western world, and the crisis is not going to be resolved by institutional means. The statistics are unambiguous. In the United States, the percentage of people who identify as Christian has fallen from approximately 78% in 2007 to approximately 63% in 2023, according to Pew Research Center data. The knowns, people who identify as religiously unaffiliated, represent approximately 28% of the adult population, up from 16% in 2007. Among adults under 30, the figure is higher still. The people who are leaving institutional religion are not, for the most part, becoming atheists. They are, as the sociologist Linda Woodhead's research documents, becoming spiritual but not religious, maintaining a genuine interest in the questions that religion addresses, while losing confidence in institutional religion's capacity to address them. They are looking for something real, and the evidence suggests that what many of them are looking for is exactly what the Thomasine tradition, buried in a jar in Egypt for 16 centuries, was pointing toward. This does not mean that the answer is simply read the Nag Hammadi texts and start meditating. The answer is not that simple, and it would be dishonest to pretend it is. The answer involves communities, not institutions organized around correct belief, but genuine communities of practice, organized around shared commitment to the kind of investigation the texts describe. It involves teachers, not gurus with manufactured authority, but people who have actually been working with this material for years and can model what it looks like to do it seriously. It involves honesty about what is hard and what is slow and what remains genuinely uncertain. The historical situation we are in is, in a strange way, an opportunity. The dissolution of institutional Christianity's monopoly on the spiritual life means that the practices and understandings that were marginalized when the institutional side won the political arguments of the 3rd and 4th centuries are now available in a way they have not been for 16 centuries. The Nag Hammadi texts are online, the scholarship is accessible, the neuroscientific research is published in open access journals. The living contemplative traditions, Buddhist, Sufi, Vedantic, as well as the surviving Christian contemplative streams, are available to serious practitioners in ways that would have been unimaginable even 50 years ago. The risk is that this availability produces what the contemplative traditions have always warned against: spiritual consumerism, the picking up and putting down of practices and ideas without the sustained commitment that genuine transformation requires. The Gospel of Thomas, saying 103, says, "Fortunate is the man who knows where the brigands will enter, so that he may get up, muster his domain, and arm himself before they enter." The brigands in this context are the forces, internal and external, that will find every available reason to interrupt the practice. Business, distraction, the seduction of novelty, discouragement when the practice does not immediately produce dramatic results, the pull toward institutional belonging as a substitute for the harder work of direct investigation. All of these are real. All of them will come up. The practice is in part learning to recognize them when they do and returning anyway. The 7-day starting practice that the tradition points toward, not as a complete curriculum but as an honest beginning, is this. For 7 days, 20 minutes per morning, you sit. You use the breath as an anchor for attention. You notice when the mind wanders and return to the breath without drama. On the 3rd day, you add the inquiry, what is aware right now? On the 5th day, you take one Thomas saying and sit with it, not analyzing it, but letting it resonate. On the 7th day, you do nothing different from the 1st day. You just sit, and at the end of the 7 days, you ask yourself honestly, what did you find? Not what did you experience? Experiences come and go, and their reliability as indicators of practice depth is low. What did you find? What do you notice? What is different? And then you do it again. Day 8 is the same as day 1, and day 90 is the same as day 8, and 3 years from now is the same as day 90, except that it is not. Because the cumulative effect of consistent practice over time is not visible day to day, but is unmistakable over longer horizons. The river does not appear to be carving the canyon, but the canyon is there. The early community that buried those texts near Nag Hammadi, whoever they were, whatever their specific practice looked like, understood something that the institutional tradition that was suppressing them understood too, which is why it suppressed them. That the project of genuinely knowing your own nature, of investigating consciousness itself with honesty and patience, is more threatening to systems organized around external authority than any argument or rebellion could be. Not because it produces people who reject authority in some adolescent way, but because it produces people who are genuinely free. Free in the Thomasine sense. Free in the sense that Paul means in Galatians when he writes that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Free from the chronic anxiety of not knowing whether you are okay. Free from the compulsive need for external validation. Free from the reflexive tribalism that says, our institution has the truth and theirs does not. Free in the sense that makes genuine love possible. Love, not as an obligation or a transaction, but as the natural expression of a consciousness that has stopped confusing itself with its own defensive structures. The next step, after 7 days of the starter practice, is not another video. It is another 7 days. And then another. The related exploration to come back to after you have done 30 days of consistent practice concerns the specific cosmological map embedded in the Nag Hammadi texts, the detailed description of what the Valentinian and Sethian Gnostic traditions called the pleroma, the fullness, and what the archons and demiurge were really pointing at as a psychological rather than cosmological description of human experience. That material deepens considerably once you have some actual practice ground to stand on. Without the practice, it is interesting but distant. With 30 days of consistent sitting, it becomes a map of territory you have begun to explore firsthand. There are specific resources that serious practitioners have found genuinely valuable, and naming them is more useful than vague encouragement to do research. For the primary sources, the standard scholarly translation is Marvin Meyer's The Nag Hammadi Scriptures, 2007, which compiles all the major texts with introductions by specialists in each tradition. It is dense but readable, and it allows you to encounter the texts themselves without the layers of interpretation that popular treatments inevitably add. For the historical context, Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Gospels remains the most accessible scholarly introduction, now supplemented by her later work Beyond Belief, 2003, which tells the story of how the Gospel of John was shaped in explicit response to the Gospel of Thomas. For the neuroscience of contemplative practice, Richard Davidson and Sharon Begley's The Emotional Life of Your Brain, 2012 is the most accessible treatment of the research from Davidson's lab. And Judson Brewer's The Craving Mind, 2017 connects the neuroscience to practical contemplative technique in ways that are directly applicable. For the cross-traditional contemplative context, the monk Cynthia Bourgeau's The Wisdom Jesus, 2008 represents one of the most serious contemporary attempts to synthesize the Thomasine material with ongoing Christian practice, written by someone who is both a rigorous scholar and a serious practitioner. The community question deserves more than a brief mention, because it is where many people who take this material seriously get stuck. The institutional church provides community, but it often requires theological conformity that people who have been through this material cannot honestly maintain. The informal spiritual community that self-organizes around shared interest often lacks the depth and discipline that genuine practice requires. What seems to work best, based on the accounts of contemporary practitioners who have navigated this, is small groups, 4 to 8 people ideally, organized not around shared belief but around shared practice. Regular meetings, not primarily for discussion and sharing of experiences, but for sitting together, for working with the text together, for honest conversation about what is actually arising in practice rather than inspirational reports of spiritual progress. The monastery in miniature, embedded in ordinary life. This is not an unusual idea. The early Christian communities, before they became institutions, were probably something like this. The Quaker meeting at its best is something like this. The Sangha, in the Buddhist context, is something like this. The form is less important than the function. A small community of people who are committed to the same investigation, who can reflect each other's experience honestly, and who will call each other back to the practice when ordinary life and ordinary distraction have taken over. There is a Thomas saying that is relevant here. Saying 25, love your brother like your soul, guard him like the pupil of your eye. The practice we have been describing is not ultimately a solitary project. It is a project of becoming capable of love, not love as sentiment or as duty, but love as the natural expression of a consciousness that has stopped treating itself as fundamentally separate from everything else. The deepest contemplative literature across traditions converges on this. The dissolution of the defensive, anxious, self-protective structure that ordinary unconscious human life is organized around is not, as it might appear, a loss. It is the opening of a capacity for genuine contact with other people and with the world that the defensive structure was preventing. You cannot fully love what you are protecting yourself from. The practice is, in the end, about learning to stop protecting yourself from reality and discovering that reality, when met directly, is not what you were afraid it was. There is one more dimension of the distinction between church faith and Jesus faith that deserves honest examination before we close, because it is the one that generates the most resistance and the most confusion. The question of ethics, one of the standard institutional church critiques of the contemplative and Gnostic tradition, is that the emphasis on inner transformation and direct knowledge tends toward antinomianism, the dismissal of ethical obligations on the grounds that those who have achieved gnosis are beyond ordinary moral constraints. And it is true that some historical Gnostic communities apparently went in this direction, using the framework of spiritual freedom to justify behavior that was harmful to others. This is a real historical phenomenon and a real danger in any tradition that emphasizes individual spiritual authority. But the more careful reading of the primary sources tells a different story. The Gospel of Philip repeatedly emphasizes the connection between genuine knowledge and genuine love. The Gospel of Thomas, saying 6, has the disciples asking Jesus about fasting and prayer and almsgiving, the conventional ethical practices of Judaism, and Jesus' answer is not those things don't matter. His answer is more nuanced. Do these things, but do them without hypocrisy, because the hypocrisy, the performance of ethical behavior for social approval rather than from genuine care, is the problem, not the practice itself. The distinction Jesus draws is between outer ethical behavior motivated by institutional pressure and social sanction, and inner ethical orientation motivated by genuine compassion arising from actual practice. The first produces compliance. The second produces something different. A person who acts well not because they are afraid of consequences or seeking approval, but because acting well has become natural to who they are. This is precisely what contemporary moral psychology has been documenting in its own vocabulary. Jonathan Haidt's research on moral foundations and the research of his colleagues Dacher Keltner and Paul Ekman on what they call moral elevation, the emotional response people have to witnessing genuine acts of virtue, suggests that the deepest ethical motivation is not rule following or fear of punishment. It is something more like inspiration, the recognition in another person's action of a quality of presence and care that we already know is possible, and that we are moved to embody ourselves. The contemplative practice we have been describing develops exactly the ground from which this kind of ethical action can arise spontaneously rather than being forced. It is not that practitioners are exempt from ethical obligations. It is that genuine practice changes what you want to do, not because you have been told to want something different, but because the investigation into your own nature reveals that the separate, defended self, whose protection occupied so much energy, is not quite what you thought it was, and that the energy formerly devoted to that protection becomes available for something else. The John of the Cross line, "Where there is no love, put love, and you will find love," is often quoted as a piece of inspirational wisdom, which it is. But it is also a precise description of a contemplative practice, deliberately acting from the orientation of love in circumstances where that orientation is not spontaneous, and discovering that the practice of acting from love produces, over time, the actual condition it was initially simulating. This is not manipulation of the self, it is training. The same logic that applies to attentional training applies to ethical training. You do not wait until you are a loving person and then act loving. You act from the orientation of love in whatever circumstance you find yourself, and the repetition of that action, sustained over time and supported by the inner work of practice, gradually changes who you are. This is the integration that makes the distinction between church faith and Jesus faith productive rather than simply critical. Not the abandonment of the institution and its ethical framework, but the animation of that framework with the inner fire that comes from actually doing the work of self-knowledge. The Gospel of Thomas ends, in some manuscript traditions, with a saying attributed to Jesus that is among the most arresting in the collection. Saying 114, the final saying, involves a dispute about whether Mary can be worthy of entry into what is called the living waters. Jesus responds with something that, in its surface form, sounds regressive. It uses language about transformation that, on a literal reading, has been deeply problematic in the history of the text's reception. But read in the context of the contemplative tradition, we have been exploring what the saying is pointing toward is something that the entire gospel has been building toward. The transformation of consciousness is not a change of social role or biological category. It is a change in the fundamental quality of awareness, a movement from what the tradition calls dead consciousness, the unconscious, automatic, anxiety-driven consciousness of ordinary human life, to living consciousness, the awake, present, self-knowing consciousness that the whole tradition is trying to point toward. This transformation, the tradition insists, is available to everyone, not to the specially gifted, not to the institutionally authorized, not to those who were already, before they began, somehow different from the rest. To everyone who seeks seriously, continues seeking when finding proves difficult, and stays with the trouble long enough to discover what is on the other side of it. The project that the earliest communities around Jesus undertook, the project that was buried near Nag Hammadi and is now, 16 centuries later, available again, is not a project of correct belief. It is a project of direct knowledge. It is not a project of institutional belonging. It is a project of the most intimate possible relationship with what you actually are. It is not comfortable, at least not initially. It is not quick. It is not guaranteed. But the evidence across 16 centuries of practitioners who have worked with this material and across the last several decades of neuroscientific research that has begun to understand what they were doing is that it is real. That the thing these texts are pointing toward is an actual territory that actual human beings can actually navigate, and that the map, though incomplete and in places difficult to read, is pointing at something worth finding. What was your experience with the practice this week? Not what did you expect, and not what you think you should have experienced. What was actually there when you looked? That question, specific, honest, first person, about what you actually found in direct experience, is the beginning of exactly the kind of investigation that the Gospel of Thomas is inviting. It is, in the end, the only question that matters. Not what the church says about you, not what the tradition says about what you should find. What did you actually find when you actually looked? The next step, after 7 days of the starter practice, is not another video. It is another 7 days, and then another. The related exploration to come back to after you have done 30 days of consistent practice concerns the specific cosmological map embedded in the Nag Hammadi texts. The detailed description of what the Valentinian and Sethian Gnostic traditions called the pleroma, the fullness, and what the archons and demiurge were really pointing at as a psychological rather than cosmological description of human experience. That material deepens considerably once you have some actual practice ground to stand on. Without the practice, it is interesting but distant. With 30 days of consistent sitting, it becomes a map of territory you have begun to explore firsthand. The Gospel of Thomas ends with a question from Peter and a response from Jesus that is not on reflection an ending at all. It is an opening, which is probably exactly how whoever wrote it intended it. These texts were not written to be consumed and filed away. They were written to be worked with, to be returned to be argued with, to be sat with in silence until they give up what they are actually saying. That is the practice. That is the faith, not the faith of the church, organized around correct propositions about someone else's experience 2,000 years ago. But the faith of the seeker who has looked carefully enough to know that there is something here worth looking for, and who has gathered the patience and the honesty and the courage to keep looking until the looking becomes, in some way that is very hard to describe in advance but immediately recognizable when it happens, its own answer. The kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you when you come to know yourselves. You will be known. That is not a metaphor. That is an invitation. The question is whether you will take it seriously enough to actually show up for the investigation.